Hello, everyone. Dr. Chris Martinson here with you, and I have an important topic today. We're going to be talking about how the Federal Reserve is massively unfair institution and is doing something that it really should not be doing with your money, with my money, with our future, and it's stoking inflation. And it's doing all of this to do a completely unfair bailout of the banks. And I'm going to walk you through and take you through that process so we can see it. Now, I like things to be fair. I don't like unlevel playing fields. Perhaps it has something to do with being a Virgo. I like the scales of justice to be pretty even and flat, not all tilted. And this is really gross what the Fed is doing. Now, the Federal Reserve has been very gross for 15, 20 years now, doing things like choosing existing homeowners at the expense of people who want to form a household, throwing inflation at us, bailing out big giant players who needed no bailing out, making gross speculators on Wall Street whole 100 cents on the dollar, buying their stuff up, and then basically shafting Main Street. So it's a distributive, I call the Federal Reserve the reverse Robin Hood organization. It steals a little bit from everybody and gives it to the few. And that's who they are. That's what they do. Do not be fooled by the hype and the marketing and the propaganda that goes around them. So let's talk about this. I want to take you through what this process is because it's important to understand. And if you do, you will understand where the puck is going to go. You'll understand what's coming next. And guess what? Spoiler alert, it's going to be a lot more inflation because the Fed can't help itself. It is going to keep bailing the system out, the banks out, their friends out. Who knows who else? Okay, not you and me usually. All right, so let's go there. So first, hey, happy news was just released today, which is April 14th at the time that I am recording this. And it's Wells Fargo, the big bank that accidentally opened lots and lots of accounts in people's names that people didn't know about, that bank. They said, wow, tops Wall Street's first quarter earnings target, $5 billion. First up, banks don't earn $5 billion, right? To earn something, you actually have to perform real work. Now, a little bit of what banks do looks like work, but the rest of it, you're just basically skimming interest. Not a lot of work, like, takes muscle power to do that. So, but let's look at the statement more carefully together down here, and I'll get my drawing tool out so I can do this. They say here, quote, Wells Fargo increased its net income by more than 30% to nearly $5 billion in the first quarter from a year ago. The bank said its net interest income, what it makes lending money minus what it pays out to customers, increased 45% on the back of soaring interest rates. 45%, that's kind of a lot. You're telling me that Wells Fargo had that much activity? You mean with declining mortgage volumes? How did they make that much money? Well, let me tell you about earning that $5 billion. Hey, listen, if you go out and you make mortgages and you do all that, you're working, you're making money. But what if somebody just handed them that money? What if that somebody was just the Federal Reserve? What if they were just given that $5 billion? Impossible, you say, right? Who would do that? Stick with me. Let's go through this story. I'm going to make this claim that the Fed is handing about $150 billion to banks this year within their ecosystem, and it's risk-free money. This is money from the Federal Reserve. It doesn't get any safer than that. There's zero risk. If you have money that the Fed is going to give you, no risk, right? There's no counterparty risk because the Fed types it up out of thin air and hands it out to the banks. What am I talking about? Well, first up, I need to just put $150 billion in context so we can set this appropriately. Oil companies, you heard a lot of, anger and disappointment and Sturm und Drang and a lot of agitation among certain quarters about the fact that oil companies had these excessive, obscene windfall profits of $200 billion, right? In 2022. Now, but let me remind you, to be in the oil business means that first up, you have extraordinary large capital expenses and risky capital expenses. I mean, here they are dropping rigs in the ocean, which sometimes get angry with us humans. Here they are, like sometimes drilling dry holes. It is, by the way, nasty, hard work. It's dangerous work. And then they do all of that so that you and I can go to the gas station and do this. Okay. They earned that. Like it's not like oil companies were just kicking around and somebody handed them $200 billion for no reason whatsoever. But that's close to what the Federal Reserve is going to do in 2023 to big banks. And it is wildly, deeply unfair because that's not what the Federal Reserve, you look at the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, under no part of that, and it's short, right? You can read the whole thing in just like maybe 15 minutes. And no part of that does it say that the Fed unilaterally has the right to print money out of thin air and hand that as profits to banks. That is completely, grossly inappropriate. And if it's not against the actual letter of the law, it's certainly bending it, but it's certainly against the spirit of how this is all supposed to work. Remember, we're in capitalism, right? Capitalism means you take capital, you put it at risk, you work hard, and something results from that. When somebody is handing you free profits printed out of thin air and putting that into your bank account, a little bit of a stretch to call those earnings, okay? So, but that's the world we're in. So it begins here. Here's where the story begins. It's not that many steps. I'll get you through it. Here we go. IORB, interest on reserve balances, formerly called IOER. They're changing the names all the time. So this is the interest rate that the Fed pays on something called reserve balances. Don't worry, we'll get to that in just a second, what those are. And here you can see as the Fed started to raise rates, so you're paying more for a mortgage, you're paying more for a car loan, you're paying more for a student loan, you're paying more on your credit cards. It was also raising this thing here, which is the amount of interest it's paying to banks on reserve balances that the banks are holding with the Fed. So this would be like getting paid. Can you imagine having your checking account at the bank be earning 4.9% interest? Because that's what that rate is. 4.9% interest. The Federal Reserve is paying these big banks 4.9% interest on the money they hold at the Fed. Okay? So that's an interesting story. Now, as a quick aside, before I finish that story out, this is the kind of story we cover at Peak Prosperity all the time. I invite you to come by. Listen, big things are happening out there, and I want you to be able to skate to where those, see where that puck is going so you can skate there first. A lot of big changes going on. Fortunes will be made and lost over these next decades. I'm going to do my best to be your information scout, get you that information, but most importantly, there are a lot of really cool people hanging out at Peak Prosperity, talking with each other, sharing their knowledge. Again, I invite you to come by, but if and only if you're the kind of person who takes action and is interested in making the most out of whatever future is coming your way. All right, so let's see. Getting back to the story. So remember, I told you this is 4 thanks for letting me do my little plug there, shamelessly. 4.9% is what the Fed is paying to banks. Well, on what? Wait, why would big banks, why would Wells Fargo have money at the Fed? Why would it do that? It's a bank already. Banks need banks. So let's go there. Here is what through all of history, banks did not keep reserve balances at the Federal Reserve. So here we are in 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. And you can see that line is like hugging the zero bound. You know why? Because banks aren't in the business of keeping reserve balances. The Fed paid no interest on them back in that period of time. So why would a bank keep money with the Fed if the Fed's not going to do anything with it or give them any interest? Banks aren't in the business of parking their cash in another bank. A bank is in the business of lending money. So if your bank has cash, but it's keeping it at the Fed, that is cash that is not coming out into the economy and doing things. It's earning a rate of interest for the bank, but it's not doing anything. So banks really aren't in the business of doing nothing. They like their money to be working, which explains why we see this line hugging that zero bound all the way through 2000. Now, but emergency, great financial crisis, 2008. All of a sudden, all the rules get chucked out. Everything that how the country had been operating through all of history in 2008 was suddenly thrown out the window. The Federal Reserve started making stuff up on the fly. They did a lot of stuff. One of the things they did is they started paying banks to keep their money back at the Fed. Now, why would you do that? Why would the Fed want to incentivize banks to keep their money back with the Fed? Because the Fed just prints money out of thin air. Let's think this through. Why would the Federal Reserve want to pay banks to keep money that the Fed just put out into the marketplace back with the Fed? The Fed doesn't need it. It makes all the money it needs by clickety-clacking on a keyboard. Why would the Federal Reserve incentivize banks to put money back with the Federal Reserve? Well, if they wanted to hand those banks billions and billions of dollars in risk-free money that they could pad their profit lines with so that those banks could be healthy and happy and whole. I mean, good work, right? Can you imagine if the Fed said, hey, here's $1 trillion, and you're like, cool, and then you stuffed it back at the Federal Reserve and they paid you 5% interest on that? Dude, you're making $50 billion a year. That is just awesome, awesome work, right? Wouldn't you take that work all day long? Well, you would. And guess what? That's exactly what the banks have been doing. So this is all of history here. Banks have not been keeping any money at the Federal Reserve, but now they are. So let's take a look at that chart. And would you, oh, snap, this is in millions of dollars, and a million is a trillion. A million's a trillion, right? That's what it is. 2 million is 2 trillion. 3 million is 3 trillion. So we see in February of 2023, $3 trillion are being kept at the Federal Reserve by big banks like Wells Fargo. And they're getting paid 4.9% interest. So we round that up to 5% on 3 trillion, round that down to 3 trillion. And guess what? That's $150 billion a year handed from the Federal Reserve to the big banks. Now, why would they want to do that? Obviously, the Federal Reserve wanted to hand lots and lots of free money to these big banks. Now, what are the banks doing to earn that $150 billion? What are they doing? Nothing. They just take the money that the Fed handed them and they put it back at the bank, at the Federal Reserve. So the Fed pushes money out into the marketplace. It ends up in the banks put it back, and then the Fed pays money to those banks for doing that. This is completely broken. It's completely ridiculous. And it's just as stupid as it looks, and unethical and immoral. Because what this is really doing is the Federal Reserve is saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take one specific industry and we're just going to give it $150 billion of pure profit. No risk, no work performed, $150 billion. Here you go. And you know what those banks do with that stuff? What does anybody do with profits? They distribute it to their C-suite people. Those people have to invest it. That goes into another bank account. Maybe they're buying stocks with it. Maybe they're buying real estate. Maybe they're buying the house that just you got foreclosed on that you used to have because you couldn't afford the new rate of mortgage. And so, but good news, there's $150 billion of fresh, hot cash floating out in the banking system that can go out and buy the house that you couldn't afford or that you just lost due to a foreclosure process. This is part and parcel of step one of the WEF's plan, which is you'll own nothing and be happy. Last part's a command. Well, if you don't own anything, who does own it? Probably the people who just got handed $150 billion free, risk-free dollars. So the Fed is busy printing money out of thin air, handing it to a very select crew of people. And then those people or institutions or entities who are owned by other people turn around and use that to then go out and buy up the actual treasure, the actual productive assets of the country in which they live. So that is the scam, and that's how it's been going. So how does this scam actually work? Let's decode it. Step one, this is total assets, blah, 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 blah. This is the Federal Reserve balance sheet. So when the Federal Reserve prints money, it doesn't print an actual currency, piece of paper, right? It's not printing actual paper money. It doesn't do that. Treasury prints that money. The Federal Reserve clickety-clicks on a keyboard and sends this money out into the universe where it will go out and say, buy a mortgage-backed security or buy a treasury bond. So let's say you had $1 million of treasury bonds in your bank, and the Federal Reserve says, I want those. It comes in, clickety-click, gives you the $1 million, takes the bond. Now, where did that $1 million come from that the Fed had? Out of thin air. So a balance sheet is assets and liabilities. The assets of the Federal Reserve are things like treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. The liabilities, well, that would be the money that it created out of thin air, right? So here we can see all the way back here, 2004, 5, 6, 7, all the way into mid-2008, nothing. The Federal Reserve balance sheet is growing slow and steady. And then, oh no, crisis, shoots up. Keeps going up a lot more, goes up a whole lot more. Remember, things were supposed to be stabilized back here in 13, 14. Federal Reserve was cranking money out. And then it tried to sort of level that off and maybe even tried to walk it back. And then there was this huge crisis in September of 2019 called the repo crisis. Huge. The Fed started to print like crazy and it needed an excuse to print even more. And good news, COVID. And then it gave it this. And then, well, COVID was fairly short-lived in terms of how long 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? Didn't matter. The Fed got hooked on that gravy train, kept printing more and more and more. And this is a total crime scene right here. Recently, they've tried to back it off a little bit, but oh no, banking crisis. So now it's shot back up again. This is a really sorry, stupid looking chart. And it just tells us that the Federal Reserve is completely addicted to printing money. And every time it tries to stop a little bit, the markets get a little upset, stocks start to fall, banks get weak, and all of a sudden everybody panics and the Fed prints more. So if you want to know how the future is going to turn out, study this chart, and you will note that whenever things get tight or tough, when the going gets tough, the Fed gets printing. Guaranteed. Take it to the bank. They're going to do it again. Okay. So this is the Fed shoving billions and trillions of dollars out into the marketplace. Again, millions of millions. So this is the Fed going from 800 billion back here in 2008 to a little over 2.2 trillion just within a few short months. So it more than doubled the total amount of money it printed out of thin air and put into circulation. That was massive. But it just, look at this. That's 1, 2, 3 trillion in one go there. Massive amounts of printing. At any rate, we went from 800 billion to tenfold higher, about 8.8 trillion here. So tenfold expansion because crisis. That's the story here. All right. Let me line those two things up. So here you can see on the top is the Federal Reserve. This is their balance sheet here, BS. And this is those excess reserves or those reserve balances. And you can see how they line up. I've got all the dates lined up here, and pretty easy to tell that the reason banks have $3 trillion to put back at the Fed is because the Fed pushed about let's call that 8 trillion. The Fed pushed 8 trillion out. 3 of those came right back to the Federal Reserve. So the Fed printed up 8 trillion, threw them out into the marketplace. 3 trillion of those came on home and landed back at the Fed. But oh no, now the Fed actually has to pay a really stiff rate of interest on those. But guess what? Not an oh no, because that's the Fed's policy. The Fed decided to do this. I don't remember voting on this. I'm pretty sure nobody I voted for had any say in this. This is just something the Federal Reserve decided to do. They said, you know what would be good? We would like to handsomely, illegitimately, and inappropriately reward banks for being banks. We love the banks. This is like in the story of Cinderella. The Federal Reserve is the stepmom, and the banks are those two ugly step sisters of Cinderella, right? It's just like anything they need. Oh my God, their profits aren't profity enough. We should help them a little bit more. Oh, they look a little tiny green around the gills. Let's give them $150 billion. This is really bad. This is no bueno, right? Because that's real money. And it comes screaming out of the Fed and goes off into the landscape out there and creates how much? A lot. Well, let's look at it. So here we are, 4.9% rate of interest times 3.021 trillion gives you $148 billion of risk-free profits straight into the balance, into the income statements of banks, big banks, right? So when you see something like, oh my God, Wells Fargo, they just crushed it. They beat estimates and they just had billion. Oh my God, look at how much they earned. Yeah, you know what? That ain't earning. That's called a scam and is being played out right now. And that's how it is. This is earning money. That's earning. This is not earning money. This is just making it up. So let's put it in context. I love context. Okay, I'll close out with this. We'll get to client context, then we'll wrap this thing up because I've been going on too long. 150 billion. Well, let's compare that. This is according to, again, economic data from the Federal Reserve itself. And they say here that total corporate profits by industry quarterly, that the total quarterly profits of the whole financial industry is about $400 billion. It's even too much, I think, but there it is. It's way too large of a percentage of the entire economy, but there it is. And they said here at 150 billion for the year is going to be divided by 4, call it $35 billion, right? Compare that to utilities. The Federal Reserve is handing more money to banks than utilities in the scheme of things. if my power company turned off, stopped operating and the lights went out, or my bank failed and stopped operating, I'd rather have electricity. It's much more important. Doesn't matter. But just to put in context, motor vehicles, total motor vehicles, bodies, trailers, parts, the whole kit and caboodle is roughly comparable to the amount of risk-free profits that the Federal Reserve just handed to banks. If you're involved in, manufacturing motor vehicles, parts, all of that, it is a very tricky, difficult business you have to work hard at to make profits. Why even bother? This is the problem with junk like this. We've seen this over and over again in history. Why bother working, sweating, taking risk, putting up with all the headaches of hiring people and having to deal with supply shortages and managing your supply chains and customers and all that? Why bother? Why not just get into the business of making money with money, called financialization? Why not just get some excess reserves and park them back at the Fed and have them just send you free money from that point forward? Obviously, this is a problem, and it should never have happened. I don't know why none of our, congressmen, senators are on the job around this, and it's neither Democrat or Republican really seem to be on the job around this. It's not that hard of a story to digest. The Federal Reserve is monkeying around with the very fabric of our society, and we should talk about that, right? It's not something that should just happen because some unelected people, most of whom are just employees of the Federal Reserve, and a few are appointed, right? But none of them are elected, that they should have this much power that they should go, we think banks should get all by themselves as much risk-free profits handed to them, courtesy of us, as the entire automotive industry seems to be able to generate. Doesn't make sense, right? And it's not fair. And by the way, it's highly corrosive to society, and it's going to create a lot of downstream problems. We should not be here. It didn't have to be this way. But we had a lot of people in positions of authority making, and I used authority, double air quotes, because they were not really doing their jobs the way they should have been doing. And they let us down. And now they've gotten themselves into a little bit of a hole. And now they're just printing 150 billion risk-free dollars and handing it out to banks because they decided to do that. That's it. There's no other reason. It's not like, if we didn't do that, the entire universe of economic stuff would have collapsed. No, they just decided, it'd be fun? What if we printed a lot of extra money and just gave it to banks? Guess what? Banks love that stuff. You come out of your Federal Reserve job, you go serve on the board of one of these big banks, door revolves. It's just gross, right? So that's the story I had for you there. Hey, listen, thanks so much for listening. Come by peakprosperity.com if you want to understand where all of this is actually going and what to do about it. See you next time. Bye.
The beauty of saying it's an emergency is very difficult to challenge any of this stuff.
Our wealth is being stolen via our money.
I would have never come here if I thought it was lost. I know we can